Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. On Snoozecast, we read excerpts from public domain works and, occasionally, original stories. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Instagram, among others. We'd like to thank our listeners. If you enjoy our show, please write us a review. Also, share it with a friend. This episode is brought to you by Copper. Tonight, we'll be reading from the 1895 novel, The Wonderful Visit by H.G. Wells. With an angel, a creature of fantasy, unlike a religious angel, as protagonist and taking place in contemporary England, the book could be classified as contemporary fantasy, although the genre was not recognized in Wells's time. The Wonderful Visit also has strong satirical themes, gently mocking customs and institutions of Victorian England, as well as idealistic rebellion itself. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. The Wonderful Visit. The Night of the Strange Bird. On the night of the strange bird, many people at Sitterton, and some nearer, saw a glare on the Sitterford moor, but no one in Sitterford saw it, for most of Sitterford was abed. All day the wind had been rising, so that the larks on the moor chirruped fitfully near the ground, or rose only to be driven like leaves before the wind. The sun set in a bloody welter of clouds, and the moon was hidden. The glare, they say, was golden like a beam shining out of the sky, not a uniform blaze, but broken all over by curving flashes like the waving of swords. It lasted but a moment and left the night dark and obscure. There were letters about it in nature, and a rough drawing that no one thought very like. You may see it for yourself, the drawing that was unlike the glare, on page 42 of volume 102 of that publication. None in Sitterford saw the light, but Annie Hooker Durgam's wife was lying awake, and she saw the reflection of it, a flickering tongue of gold, dancing on the wall. She, too, was one of those who heard the sound. The others who heard the sound were Lumpy Durgan and Amory's mother. They said it was a sound like children singing and a throbbing of harp strings, carried on a rush of notes like that which sometimes comes from an organ. It began and ended like the opening and shutting of a door. And before and after they heard nothing but the night wind howling over the moor and the noise of the caves under Sitterford Cliff. Amory's mother said she wanted to cry when she heard it, but Lumpy was only sorry he could hear no more. That is as much as anyone can tell you of the glare upon Sitterford Moor and the alleged music therewith. And whether these had any real connection with the strange bird whose history follows is more than I can say. But I set it down here for reasons that will be more apparent as the story proceeds. The coming of the strange bird. Sandy Bright was coming down the road from Spinner's carrying a side of bacon he had taken in exchange for a clock. He saw nothing of the light, but he heard and saw the strange bird. He suddenly heard a flapping and voice like a woman wailing. And being a nervous man and all alone, he was alarmed forthwith, and turning, all a-tremble, saw something large and black against the dim darkness of the cedars up the hill. It seemed to be coming right down upon him, and incontinently he dropped his bacon and set off running, only to fall headlong. He tried in vain, such was his state of mind, to remember the beginning of the Lord's Prayer. The strange bird flapped over him, something larger than himself, with a vast spread of wings, and, as he thought, black. He screamed and gave himself up for lost. Then it went past him, sailing down the hill, and soaring over the vicarage, vanished into the hazy valley towards Sitterford. And Sandy Bright lay upon his stomach there, for ever so long, staring into the darkness after the strange bird. At last he got up upon his knees and began to thank heaven for his merciful deliverance, with his eyes downhill. He went on down into the village, talking aloud and confessing his sins as he went, lest the strange bird should come back. All who heard him thought him drunk, but from that night he was a changed man, and had done with drunkenness and defrauding the revenue by selling silver ornaments without a license. And the side of bacon lay upon the hillside until the tallyman from Port Burdock found it in the morning. The next who saw the strange bird was a solicitor's clerk at Ipping Hanger, who was climbing the hill before breakfast to see the sunrise. Save for a few dissolving wisps of cloud, the sky had been blown clear in the night. At first he thought it was an eagle he saw. It was near the zenith and incredibly remote, a mere bright speck above the pink cirri, and it seemed as if it fluttered and beat itself against the sky, as an imprisoned swallow might do against a window pane. Then down it came into the shadow of the earth, sweeping in a great curve towards Port Burdock and round over the Hanger, and so vanishing behind the woods of Siddermorton Park. It seemed larger than a man. Just before it was hidden, the light of the rising sun smote over the edge of the downs and touched its wings, and they flashed with the brightness of flames and the color of precious stones, and so passed, leaving the witness agape. A plowman, going to his work, along under the stone wall of Siddermorton Park, saw the strange bird flash over him for a moment and vanish among the hazy interstices of the beech trees. But he saw little of the color of the wings, witnessing only that its legs, which were long, seemed pink and bare, like naked flesh, and its body mottled white. It smote like an arrow through the air and was gone. These were the first 3 eyewitnesses of the strange bird. Now, in these days, one does not cower before the devil and one's own sinfulness, or see strange iridescent wings in the light of dawn, and say nothing of it afterwards. The young solicitor's clerk told his mother and sisters at breakfast, and, afterwards, on his way to the office at Port Burdock, spoke of it to the blacksmith of Hammer Pond, and spent the morning with his fellow clerks, marveling instead of copying deeds. And Sandy Bright went to talk the matter over with Mr. Jekyll, the primitive minister, and the plowman told old Hugh, and afterwards the vicar of Siddermorton. I wonder how much of that was true. Barring that he thinks the wings were brown, it sounds uncommonly like a flamingo. The hunting of the strange bird. The vicar of Siddermorton, which is 9 miles inland from Siddermouth as the crow flies, was an ornithologist. Some such pursuit, botany, antiquity, folklore, is almost inevitable for a man in his position. He was given to geometry also, propounding occasionally impossible problems in the educational times, but ornithology was his forte. He had already added 2 visitors to the list of occasional British birds. His name was well known in the columns of the zoologist. I am afraid it may be forgotten by now, for the world moves apace. And on the day after the coming of the strange bird, came first one and then another to confirm the plowman's story and tell him, not that it had any connection, of the glare upon Sidderford Moor. Now, the vicar of Siddermorton had 2 rivals in his scientific pursuits. Gully of Sidderton, who had actually seen the glare, and who it was sent the drawing to nature, and Borland, the natural history dealer, who kept the marine laboratory at Port Burdock. Borland, the vicar thought, should have stuck to his copepods, but instead he kept a taxidermist, and took advantage of his position to pick up rare seabirds. It was evident to anyone who knew anything of collecting that both these men would be scouring the country after the strange visitant before 24 hours were out. The vicar's eye rested on the back of Saunders's British birds, for he was in his study at the time. Already in 2 places there was entered. The only known British specimen was secured by the Reverend K. Hillier, vicar of Siddermorton. A 3rd such entry. He doubted if any other collector had that. He looked at his watch. 2. He had just lunched, and usually he rested in the afternoon. He knew it would make him feel very disagreeable if he went out into the hot sunshine, both on the top of his head and generally. Yet Gully perhaps was out, prowling, observant. Suppose it was something very good, and Gully got it. His gun stood in the corner. The thing had iridescent wings and pink legs. The chromatic conflict was certainly exceedingly stimulating. He took his gun. He would have gone out by the glass doors and veranda and down the garden into the hill road in order to avoid his housekeeper's eye. He knew his expeditions were not approved of, but advancing towards him up the garden, he saw the curate's wife and her 2 daughters carrying tennis rackets. His curate's wife was a young woman of immense will, who used to play tennis on his lawn and cut his roses, differ from him on doctrinal points, and criticize his personal behavior all over the parish. He went in abject fear of her, was always trying to propitiate her, but so far he had clung to his ornithology. However, he went out by the front door. The hunting of the strange bird continued. If it were not for collectors, England would be full, so to speak, of rare birds and wonderful butterflies, strange flowers, and 1,000 interesting things. But happily the collector prevents all that, either killing with his own hands or buying extravagantly, procuring people of the lower classes to kill such eccentricities as appear. It makes work for people, even though acts of Parliament interfere. In this way, for instance, he is killing off the chow in Cornwall, the bath-white butterfly, the Queen of Spain fritillary, and can plume himself upon the extermination of the great auk, and 100 other rare birds and plants and insects. All that is the work of the collector and his glory alone, in the name of science. And this is right, and as it should be. Eccentricity, in fact, is immortality. Think over it again if you do not think so now. Just as eccentricity in one's way of thinking is madness, I defy you to find another definition that will fit all the cases of either. And if a species is rare, it follows that it is not fitted to survive. The collector is, after all, merely like the foot soldier in the days of heavy armor. He leaves the combatants alone, so one may go through England from end to end in the summertime and see only 8 or 10 commonplace wildflowers, and the commoner butterflies, and a dozen or so common birds, and never be offered by any breach of the monotony, any splash of strange blossom, or flutter of unknown wing. All the rest have been collected years ago, for which cause we should all love collectors, and bear in mind what we owe them when their little collections are displayed. These little drawers of theirs, their glass cases, and blotting paper books, are the graves of the rare and the beautiful. the symbols of the triumph of leisure, morally spent, over the delights of life, all of which, as you very properly remark, has nothing whatever to do with the strange bird. There is a place on the moor where the black water shines among the succulent moss and the hairy sundew. Eater of careless insects, spreads its red-stained, hungry hands to the god who gives his creatures, one to feed another. On a ridge thereby grow birches with a silvery bark, and the soft green of the larch mingles with the dark green fir. Thither through the honey-humming heather came the vicar in the heat of the day, carrying a gun under his arm, a gun loaded with swan shot for the strange bird. And over his disengaged hand he carried a pocket handkerchief, wherewith, ever and again, he wiped his beady face. He went by and on past the big pond, and the pool full of brown leaves where the sitter arises, and so by the road, which is at first sandy and then chalky, to the little gate that goes into the park. There are 7 steps up to the gate, and on the further side 6 down again, lest the deer escape, so that when the vicar stood in the gateway, his head was 10 feet or more above the ground. And looking where a tumult of bracken fronds filled the hollow between 2 groups of beech, his eye caught something party-colored that wavered and went. Suddenly his face gleamed, and his muscles grew tense. He ducked his head, clutched his gun with both hands, and stood still. Then, watching keenly, he came down the steps into the park, and still holding his gun with both hands, crept rather than walked towards the jungle of bracken. Nothing stirred, and he almost feared that his eyes had played him false, until he reached the ferns and had gone, rustling breast high, into them. Then suddenly rose something full of wavering colors, 20 yards or less in front of his face, and beating the air. In another moment it had fluttered above the bracken and spread its pinions wide. He saw what it was. His heart was in his mouth, and he fired out of pure surprise and habit. There was a cry of superhuman agony. The wings beat the air twice, and the victim came slanting swiftly downward and struck the ground, a struggling heap of broken wing and flying blood-stained plumes upon the turfy slope behind. The vicar stood aghast, with his smoking gun in his hand. It was no bird at all, but a youth with an extremely beautiful face, clad in a robe of saffron and with iridescent wings, across whose pinions great waves of color, flushes of purple and crimson, golden green and intense blue, pursued one another as he writhed in his agony. Never had the vicar seen such gorgeous floods of color. Not stained glass windows, not the wings of butterflies, not even the glories of crystals seen between prisms. No colors on earth could compare with them. Twice the angel raised himself, only to fall over sideways again. Then the beating of the wings diminished. The terrified face grew pale. The floods of color abated, and suddenly he lay prone, and the changing hues of the broken wings faded swiftly into one uniform, dull, gray hue. "Oh, what has happened to me?" cried the angel, for such it was. Shuddering, hands outstretched and clutching the ground, and then lying still. "Dear me," said the vicar, "I had no idea." He came forward cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. "I am afraid I have shot you." It was the obvious remark. The angel seemed to become aware of his presence for the first time. He raised himself by one hand. His brown eyes stared into the vicar's. Then, with a gasp, and biting his nether lip, he struggled into a sitting position and surveyed the vicar from top to toe. "A man," said the angel, clasping his forehead. "A man in the maddest black clothes, and without a feather upon him. Then I was not deceived. I am indeed in the land of dreams."